Imagine stepping outside on a winter morning. The air stings your face. Your fingers begin to ache after only a few minutes. You pull your jacket tighter and hurry back inside. Now imagine there is no jacket, no heated house, no grocery store, no roads, no emergency shelter, only endless snow stretching to the horizon. Temperatures below minus 50 degrees Celsius, minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Months of darkness, and every mistake could cost your life before sunrise. Today, almost nobody lives in conditions like these without modern technology. Yet around 31,000 years ago, groups of ancient humans did something that seems almost impossible. They moved into northeastern Siberia, one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth. Not just for a season, for generations. For decades, archaeologists believed this couldn't be true. They assumed humans simply lacked the tools to survive such extreme cold. But in 2001, a discovery buried beneath the frozen ground of the Yana River changed that story forever. It forced scientists to ask a completely different question, not whether ancient humans could survive the Arctic, but how. And once you understand their answer, you begin to see that the greatest survival tool our species ever developed wasn't strength, it was preparation. In northern Siberia, winter doesn't simply arrive, it takes over. Near the Arctic Circle, the sun barely rises for weeks. Rivers freeze into solid highways of ice, trees disappear from the landscape, the wind carries tiny crystals of snow that can freeze exposed skin in less than a minute. Even today, cities like Yakutsk regularly record temperatures below minus 40 degrees Celsius. Cars are left running because their engines may never restart. Metal becomes brittle. Batteries fail. Yet, long before engines, electricity, or insulated clothing, humans entered an even harsher version of this world during the last ice age. The evidence comes from a site called Yana RHS, short for Yana Rhinoceros Horn Site. Located roughly 71 degrees north latitude, it lies more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest forest. When Russian archaeologist Vladimir Pitulko began excavating the site, he expected little more than scattered animal bones. Instead, his team uncovered thousands of carefully crafted stone tools, ivory spear points, needles, decorated objects, the remains of ancient camps. Radiocarbon dating revealed an astonishing age, about 31,600 years old. At the time, this was the oldest known evidence of humans living so far north. The discovery overturned decades of assumptions about where our species could survive, but it also created a mystery. Because surviving wasn't supposed to be possible, the landscape around Yana offered almost none of the resources humans usually depended on. There were very few trees for firewood, almost no edible plants during winter, temperatures cold enough to freeze flesh in minutes, and predators everywhere: woolly mammoths, steppe bison, Arctic wolves, cave lions. Even today, experienced Arctic explorers carry satellite communications, insulated shelters, and emergency supplies. Ancient humans carried none of these. So what kept them alive? For years, scientists searched for a single answer. Maybe thicker clothing, maybe larger fires, maybe extraordinary physical adaptations. Because every object found at Yana hinted at something far more sophisticated than simple endurance. These people weren't merely surviving the Arctic, they were building an entire system designed around it. One of the biggest clues wasn't a weapon, it was a needle. Among the discoveries at Yana were finely shaped bone and ivory needles, each with carefully drilled eyes. At first glance, they seem ordinary, until you realize what they represent. Making a needle isn't easy. It requires selecting dense bone or mammoth ivory, shaping it without breaking it, grinding it smooth, then drilling a hole only a few millimeters wide using stone tools. Even experienced craftspeople can spend hours making a single needle today using traditional techniques. So why invest so much effort? Because loose animal skins aren't enough in Arctic conditions. Modern experiments show that air trap between multiple fitted layers provides dramatically better insulation than simply wrapping yourself in thick fur. The clothing itself becomes a shelter. Ethnographic studies of the Nenets, Evenki, and Inuit People who have survived Arctic climates for centuries show the same principle again and again. Double-layered garments, fur facing inward, fur facing outward, tiny stitched seams that stop warm air from escaping. Every stitch matters. The Yana needles suggest that Ice Age humans understood this tens of thousands of years earlier, not through science, through experience. Generation after generation learning exactly what worked and what didn't. But clothing alone couldn't solve another problem. Even the warmest fur eventually gets wet. Sweat freezes, snow melts, moisture steals body heat nearly 25 times faster than dry air. A single mistake during a hunting trip could become fatal long before reaching camp. Which meant surviving the Arctic wasn't just about staying warm, it was about managing heat every hour of every day. And that's where the landscape itself became one of their greatest inventions. Except the frozen ground held another secret that archaeologists wouldn't fully understand until much later. The Arctic looks empty. But to ancient humans, it was filled with opportunities, if you knew where to look. In 2020, researchers studying the Yana River site noticed something unusual about the arrangement of animal bones. They weren't scattered randomly across the landscape. Many had been deliberately placed. Mammoth tusks formed boundaries. Large shoulder blades lay in repeated patterns. Stone tools clustered around specific areas. This wasn't the aftermath of a hunt. It was the blueprint of a home. Unlike the forests farther south, northern Siberia offered almost no timber. During the Ice Age, much of the region was a vast mammoth steppe, a cold, dry grassland stretching from Europe to Alaska. Trees were scarce. Firewood was precious. So ancient humans turned to the largest animals on Earth. A fully grown woolly mammoth could weigh over 6 tons. Its tusks stretched nearly 4 meters long. After a successful hunt, or after scavenging a carcass, almost every part of the animal had value. The meat provided food, the hide became clothing, the fat became fuel, and the bones became architecture. At sites like Mezherych in present-day Ukraine, dating to about 15,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered circular dwellings built from more than 100 mammoth bones. Skulls formed walls. Tusks acted as supports. The structures were then covered with hides, creating insulated shelters that trapped precious heat. Yana is older and less complete, but the principle appears strikingly similar. When your environment offers no trees, you don't wait for better conditions. You build with what survived the winter alongside you. But here's where it gets stranger. These shelters weren't designed to keep out the cold. They were designed to keep in the people. Heat is surprisingly difficult to maintain. A single person at rest produces about 100 watts of body heat. That doesn't sound like much, but place several people together inside a well-insulated shelter, and the temperature can rise dramatically without burning enormous amounts of fuel. Ethnographic studies of traditional Arctic societies show that families often slept close together, not simply for comfort, but because shared body heat reduced the amount of firewood required overnight. Every extra person became another source of warmth. Survival wasn't an individual achievement, it was a collective one. This idea appears again and again in prehistoric archaeology. At Yana, thousands of artifacts suggest repeated occupation by organized groups rather than isolated hunters. There were areas for tool-making, areas for butchering animals, areas likely used for preparing hides. Each task required different skills. Some people hunted, others repaired clothing. Others shaped ivory into tools that might not be needed until the following season. No one could master everything. The Arctic demanded specialization. It also demanded trust. Because one failed hunter didn't necessarily mean one person went hungry. It meant the entire camp faced risk. Sharing food wasn't an act of generosity, it was insurance. Anthropologist Kim Hill, who spent decades studying modern hunter-gatherer societies, found that successful hunters often distributed most of their catch throughout the group. At first, this seems inefficient, until you remember that hunting success is unpredictable. Today you return with a mammoth-sized reward. Tomorrow you may return with nothing. Over weeks and months, sharing smooths out those extremes. Everyone survives more consistently. In a place where winter could last 8 months, predictability was more valuable than abundance. But there was still a problem. Even the best shelter and the strongest social bonds couldn't create food where none existed. Eventually, every camp faced the same question. What happens when the animals disappear? For many years, scientists assumed Ice Age humans simply followed mammoth herds wherever they wandered. The reality was far more complex. At Yana, archaeologists recovered the bones of horses, bison, reindeer, Arctic foxes, wolves, hares, fish, and even birds. This wasn't a community dependent on one animal. It was a community built around flexibility. If mammoths became scarce, hunters shifted to reindeer. If large game migrated away, fishing and trapping became more important. If fresh meat wasn't available, stored food bridged the gap. Chemical analyses of animal bones also revealed another crucial detail. These hunters weren't wasting the fattest parts. Bone marrow, brain tissue, and animal fat appear to have been prized resources. That makes perfect biological sense. In extreme cold, your body burns enormous amounts of energy simply staying warm. Protein alone isn't enough. In fact, eating too much lean meat without sufficient fat can lead to a dangerous condition. Explorers later called rabbit starvation. Despite consuming large quantities of meat, the body struggles because it lacks enough fat to meet its energy demands. Animal fat contains more than twice the calories per gram compared with protein or carbohydrates. To an Arctic hunter, fat wasn't a luxury, it was fuel. Every successful hunt meant more than tonight's dinner. It meant heat stored inside your own body for the days ahead. And ancient humans planned for those days constantly. Stone blades at Yana show microscopic wear patterns consistent with processing hides and butchering frozen meat. Some ivory tools were likely used to repair equipment long before it failed. Nothing suggests people were merely reacting to emergencies. Everything suggests they expected them. They prepared months in advance for problems that hadn't happened yet. That ability may have been the single greatest advantage our species ever evolved. But preparation alone doesn't explain the most astonishing part of the story. Because surviving Siberia wasn't the end of the journey, it was only the beginning. Every winter coat hanging by your door, every meal stored in your kitchen, every weather alert on your phone is built on the same invisible instinct that once carried a small group of hunters across the frozen plains of Siberia over 30,000 years ago. The cold has changed. The world has changed. But the mind that learned to survive it is still yours.